I'd now like to welcome my colleague Ravi Agrawal, the editor of Foreign Policy, who is going to have a conversation with Catherine Russell of UNICEF. We're so excited about that. Please do join us.
Okay, hi everyone. You know what, before I start, I'm just realizing that there are a few empty chairs inside, so I'm just going to ask if you are staying seated to try and move in a little bit. Thank you. I'm just going to ask you all to move in a teeny bit so we have a little bit more room for everyone to sit down. Hi everyone, I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine and the host of FP Live. It is my pleasure to bring on stage our next guest. She has had several very important roles in US government, including as ambassador at large for Global Women's Issue, where she integrated women's issues across every aspect of US foreign policy. She's also run President Biden's personnel office, but she's here in Davos this week in a very different role as the executive director of UNICEF. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Catherine Russell. It's great to have you. All right. I think that's on. Let's just test that out. Yes, it is. Okay, excellent. Catherine, thank you for making time. Thank you for being here.
Happy to, of course.
You know what, before I actually get going, ladies and gentlemen, at the back, if I can just ask for a wee bit of silence in the room there at the back, and do come in and sit down. I promise we won't bite. Okay, Catherine, let's get going. Okay. You know, big picture question, not about UNICEF, but just to start with the state of the world. Give us a sense of how you look at the world in 2026. There are obviously many conflicts that make your job harder. There's also a sense that the rules-based order is more challenged than it's been in a generation. Talk about that a bit.
Well, thank you, first of all, and it's nice to see you. I think there's no question that the geopolitical world is really tumultuous right now. And of course, that has an impact on UNICEF. At UNICEF, everything we do is focused on children and how things impact children. And so these big changes in the world are having an impact on us in a couple ways. One, and probably most directly, is because the countries led by the U.S., but certainly not just the U.S. and many European countries have really diminished and cut their development assistance, and also, I think, challenged whether development even makes sense for countries to do, which is very worrying, right? And I think, so that's a big problem for us, and we're trying to work through it. We've had to make cuts at UNICEF, as have all UN agencies and most of the NGOs as well. And we're trying to make ourselves sharper and better and more efficient, but there's no question that we can't possibly do more with less, right? So we will have to figure out how to at least do what we were doing before. The big problem is that the needs are so enormous in the world.
And they're growing, right? It feels
they're
like
growing,
sort of the manufacturing of conflicts and crises is just on sort of warp speed of sorts, which then makes it's like whack-a-mole.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, it doesn't seem like any conflict ever really ends, which is a problem. I mean, that's an overstatement, but it's largely true. These things go on and on. We've had big conflicts in the last few years. The first 2 months I was in the job, the Ukraine crisis started, and then, of course, Gaza. But we have many other big things. Sudan is a massive challenge for everybody in the world, but certainly for the children who live there and for the folks who are trying to respond to it. I would say, the difficulties are enormous. The funding is diminished. And I think also, and just as important as the funding, is the questioning of whether there should be a multilateral system, should there be humanitarian response or not. And I think that is very worrying.
Yeah, how much has that damaged the work that you do at UNICEF?
Well, I would say at this point, we've been able to maintain most of the work. We've had to cut our staff about 20%, which was very traumatic, as you can imagine, because people who go to work for UNICEF mostly think of this as a calling, so it's not like you lose your job down the block, which is, would be traumatic for anybody anyway, but these are people who so identify with UNICEF, and so saying, I'm sorry, we can't afford this anymore, has been traumatic. So it's been difficult. We have had to reprioritize a lot. We've consolidated efforts. So it's forced us, there's always a silver lining. I mean, there's one good piece, which is it's forced us to say, what is the essential work? What do we really need to get done? And also, and really importantly, how do we think about expanding the pool of people who are focused on children, who are thinking about children? So more partnerships, different partnerships. It's pushing the UN to work a little bit differently together, at least to examine how we do that. So that's a plus. But I would say overall, it's definitely diminished resources in a time when we really need more resources. And so you can do a lot with efficiencies and being more effective, but you can't do everything.
That makes sense. When you look around the world, I mean, obviously you've had to make personnel cuts, which is painful, and I'm sorry about that. But in terms of the countries and the conflicts in which you would like to be more active, but you cannot, I know you would say all of them, but which are the areas that you think are suffering the most?
Well, I would just say overall, the big challenge is the conflicts that we're working in are really complex and very challenging for children. So Ukraine is, the violence there is very difficult. Many children have been displaced. Gaza, I mean, you've all seen Gaza on the news. You know what that looks like. Thinking about what the next stages are there is really challenging at a time when we're still just trying to provide life-saving support for children who are already homeless, exposed to terrible cold rain, not in school. It just persists. I think the biggest challenge that I would look at and worry about is Sudan, which many people have some sense of, but just in terms of numbers, I mean, we have millions and millions of children who are on the move. We have millions of children who are hungry. We have children who are facing unbelievable violence. I mean, I was there just before Christmas, and the stories I heard were, I'm pretty used to bad stories, but they were terrible stories, honestly. I mean, one little boy was telling me, it wasn't so much harshness about his story, but I met him in a community, it was a boys' school, in a community called Kassala, and he described how his family lived in Al Fashir, and they had to keep moving, trying to run away from the militants. And every time they would go someplace, there would be more militants, and they would stop the family and threaten the family and demand resources. And so, he's a little kid. He's like 8 years old, and this is what his experience is. The girls, and I would say in many places, boys were killed. So it was hair-raising for the parents. But girls are facing a certain kind of horror there, which is just really high rates of sexual violence. Often girls raped by multiple people, frequently in front of family and communities, all for the purpose of terrifying the communities. And it's effective. It does terrify people. And hearing those stories from girls, I know it happens, but it's still heartbreaking. The upside is I still meet children, young people, girls who still think that they have a future ahead of them, which is at the same time really heartbreaking and really encouraging. You meet a girl who, in all likelihood, is not going to have a life that she really imagines, but she still imagines it. They'll still say, I want to be a doctor, I want to be an engineer, I want to be this. And I think, God, I mean, we have to do what we can to protect those dreams, but it seems really insurmountable in some of the situations where they're living.
Gosh, I don't know how you do it. When I think of the obstacles that you face, I mean, obviously, I imagine the biggest one is that conflicts keep happening and new ones keep emerging. But if you put that to aside for a minute, there's funding, obviously, which you mentioned. What are the other things that you are looking to get countries to cooperate on to improve outcomes?
Look, I think one of the biggest challenges many countries are facing, putting aside the conflict countries, right, and the really fragile countries, many countries are facing very difficult economic situations. So when we, the international community, say, okay, we're cutting back aid, okay, you need to be more self-sufficient, okay. You know, what we do at UNICEF is work hard to try to build capacity of countries so that they can take care of their children themselves. So we try to build the health system, build the education system. But when we go to countries and say, you need to pay for more of this, you know, you need to take on more of the burden, you can't pay, 3% of your GDP for education, you have to do better. They say, well, we don't have any money, right? They often don't have good tax systems or any tax systems. They often face something else which is really problematic, which is a lot of debt, right? Where they sometimes are paying more to service their debts than they can pay for education, healthcare, and child protection combined, right? So for us to say to countries, you need to do better, okay, fair enough, and I think that's probably right. Governments do need to take on more responsibility. They are the duty bearers for their children, but they need help getting there. And we see ourselves as trying to help build the capacity, explain how you build a health system that takes care of primary health care for children, and how you make sure that children are getting educated. And we do a lot of work all around the world so we can bring lessons from different places. But we also have to recognize that some of these countries, there are places where you have bad leadership. I'm not going to pretend there's not, and corruption and other things. But there are also a lot of well-meaning people who really can't see their way out of the debt that they're in.
We're in Davos. There are so many billionaires and centibillionaires here. Is money really the problem? And is, what is the hurdle here?
It's such a good question, because I always think that I have someone in my family works in banking, and I'm always like, there is a lot of money out there. I know it's out there. The question is just, where does it go, right? And what are the priorities? And it's not, in my mind, so much individuals. I mean, individuals do a lot of giving. I'm not sure that's really, and we appreciate that and encourage it for sure. But I do think there need to for UNICEF and for other agencies like us, governments are the ones who are our primary supporters. And so for UNICEF, we have a very advanced effort on private sector fundraising. We've been doing it for years. We have sort of entities in every rich country where they mobilize resources and really try to advocate for more spending. And so the governments provide about 75% of our funding. So now, obviously, governments are providing funding that's provided to them by their taxpayers, right? So it's still individuals paying for it, but I think really governments are the ones who have an obligation, in my mind, to say we need to do better.
But then isn't that biased towards richer countries which would have fewer problems to begin with?
Well, I'm saying they are the ones who should be mobilizing the resources for poorer countries, right? And I would say certainly even in rich countries, you can't find a country in the world where there aren't problems for children and problems for women. That is certainly the case. Everyone has work to do and to do better. But big countries, rich countries, can certainly, I think, afford to give more money to countries and poor people in countries who don't have that money.
Talk to us a bit about the problems in richer countries. I feel like I've focused a fair bit on conflict zones with you here, but I recognize that's just one part of the puzzle.
Well, rich countries, I mean, the interesting thing is they have the capacity to do things for their citizens. That's not to say they always do it, right? They can do it. They have the ability to raise resources, but certainly I would say there are issues that children face everywhere, and most of that in rich countries is related to poverty. Poor communities suffer more. They have less access to health care. They have less access to good education. I mean, it's kind of the same problems you can imagine. I'm not sure where you're from, but in probably most rich countries, you have the same challenges. Some countries probably have much better social services, but all countries face some challenges. The big problem, and one thing that I worry about a lot, is that the problem of violence is something that we see in every country, and that's worrying. Violence against women, violence against children. With children, some of it is, sort of people thinking that they're just doing good parenting. But, we try to teach different ways to do that. Violence against women.
And a lot of this is at home, right?
Oh, yeah.
Both violence
at
against
home.
women and bad parenting, of course.
Most of it is, yeah. And, I actually came into this work through that avenue of violence against women. And I was shocked to see the numbers that really there's no country that doesn't have an issue with violence against women. And I think that ultimately comes to whether and how women and girls are valued in a society. Are they seen as equal? Are they seen as, entitled to be sort of living a life without violence?
Is there an example of a country that had some of the societal, cultural issues you're describing and managed to turn it around?
I mean, honestly, the country I know best is the United States because I'm an American, and that's where I did some of this work. And back, excuse me, in the mid-1990s, the United States passed legislation that was federal legislation on violence against women. And that was the first time, I think, that it brought that issue to that level of attention for sure. But I was working in the Senate at the time, and we would do hearings, and police would come in and they'd testify, and they'd say, well, if we go to a home and the husband has hit the wife, which is usually the way it works, not always, but usually, a lot of times the police would say to the husband, just take a walk around the block and cool off. And then they would say to the woman, well, you could press charges, but do you really want to press charges? You've got the kids here, how do you think about that? And so it was not, it wasn't treated as, it was treated as something of a family matter. And you see that all around the world where it should be treated as a crime, like any other crime, any other person who gets battered. You wouldn't say, oh, take a walk around the block, and do you really want to prosecute? No, of course not. So I think there was a sea change in the United States. And certainly the numbers overall of violence against women went down, but it persists as a problem there as it does in other places.
So what is the lesson there that other countries can learn? I mean, I'm sure there isn't a one-size-fits-all formula, but what are the lessons that you can provide either on reducing violence against women or children?
Yeah. I think the main thing you're trying to do is change behavior and change norms. In my mind, the most important thing is you have to get legislation in place first, right? It can't be like a question about whether it's okay or not. It has to be clear that it is not okay to batter your spouse, right? And then the problem is that you can't just pass a law. And this is what we see in some countries that don't have a lot of capacity, because in the United States, what happened was we passed the law, and then there was a lot of funding that went to local organizations, civil society organizations, who provide services and counseling. And all of that has to come behind it. And that can be really challenging because it's not inexpensive to do that. But you first have to set the norms, and then you have to bring the support behind it to try to change the way people view it.
In much of the developing...
Can I say one other thing? I don't know how
course.
many Americans are here, but if you remember back in the day, I'm looking at you, you're all so young, but they used to joke about hitting a woman on TV. It's like, oh, your wife has a big, there was I can't remember the character, but it was like, oh, smack her in the face or something, and it was like people would make jokes about it. That does not, you don't see that on mainstream TV. And that's what I mean about changing the way people think about that. And that takes a lot of work.
Gosh, well, thank God for that. There's a sense that in much of the developing world, one of the big transformative things was the smartphone for a variety of reasons. But, for many people, it was their first camera, their first TV, their first MP3 player, their first map, their first private thing, because they never had a private TV or a private radio. And there was this sense that maybe this would lead to more freedom. That maybe, what the car did for the United States, the phone would do for many developing countries around the world. I'm not sure that's been borne out. I mean, I would have imagined 10 years on from the mass proliferation of the internet and smartphones in every hand. This is more for women than for children, who obviously will not access them for a while longer. But, is it your sense that on a trendline basis, these devices offer some glimmers of hope for people to have more freedom, to have an ability to compare themselves with global peers, to ask for more?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it that much, but I think I would say on balance, it's a plus, right? Because a lot of things early on, and it's still the case, although hopefully we're seeing less of it, but you would see in many places a family would have a phone, right? And the wife wouldn't have access to the phone, and the man would control it. And so I think just the fact that there are phones doesn't always mean that people who are really vulnerable have access to them. I think that the phone in general, if you think about it from the perspective of children, we see great potential for children in internet access and learning and ability to sort of understand what kind of world there is out there. It comes with it's real dangerous for children as well, and we're worried about that. The conversations now are largely around AI and what that will mean for children, but I think with any new technology, there are great opportunities, and there's real potential. Potential on the education side. We're looking forward to that. Potential in healthcare. We have primary healthcare workers in the world who have smartphones and can now track birth registrations, and they can track immunizations, and all of that is a plus, huge plus. But we also see that children can be really isolated and be looking at images and things on phones that we don't want them to look at. They're really vulnerable to that, and so I think the technology to me is like just another version of what it was before, right?
Yeah.
Which is the same difficulties, maybe with different. They present differently, but you've got to be aware of whatever change there is and how that impacts children.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As a journalist, one of the things I worry about the most, and I'm sure everyone here does too, is the rise of misinformation and disinformation, which I suppose is even more dangerous, and then AI can, supercharge all of that stuff. I feel like this has been the case for the better part of 15 or 20 years, but never before has media literacy and digital literacy been more important, and I just cannot imagine a better time to start that than when you're a child. When you look around the world, do you see that as something that is taking off, or is it really being ignored?
It's not being ignored, but I wouldn't say it's taking off either. I think people understand that it needs to happen. I'm just not sure how quickly it's happening. I mean, I've seen some interesting reports saying that young people are actually more able to discriminate between good and bad media because they're more accustomed to it.
They're digitally native.
Yeah, than somebody my age who's like doesn't know what the hell. So I think maybe there's some of that, but I do think it has to be intentional to really work with children, and I think. Children are vulnerable. I mean, that's everybody who knows a child knows that, and it's worrying to think about some of the things that we're seeing now with these images of children. I mean, I don't understand it, and I am horrified by it, but I know that it goes on, and I'm worried about what that means, certainly for these children, but also just more generally for the population when that becomes so ubiquitous. It's like, how can we have a world like that where children are treated that way? But there we are.
If you had a magic wand and you could just swish it around and get everyone in Davos to walk away with one set of facts that you really care about, or feel energized to do one thing, what would that be?
That's interesting. I would say that if everyone could walk away understanding that the world is really complicated and difficult for children, and that we all need to, as a world community, try to protect children as best we can. And there's something that everyone can do in that space. Governments obviously have a lot to do, but the private sector is important, and individuals are important too. Just bring it up, raise it with people who have some ability to do something. There are all sorts of organizations doing great work, but I think as a world, we're so separated now and so divided, and it feels to me like children is a place where people can come together. It's not about party or ideology, it's about protecting the greatest resource the planet has, which is children. And if we don't do that, if they're not healthy and they're not educated, imagine what kind of world we're going to have. So I think if we all share that responsibility and share the commitment to making a better future for them, I think the world will be better off.
I can sign up for that. Catherine Russell, thank you so much.